The line stretched ahead of him like a prison sentence. Harold Martinez clutched his renewal papers with trembling hands, the same hands that once steadied a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam 53 years ago. At 74, he stood barely, 5 feet 6 inches, his shoulders curved from decades of carrying burdens no one could see. The DMV clerk barely glanced up when he reached the counter. "Next," she barked, her voice sharp as broken glass. Harold shuffled forward, his worn leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "I need to renew my driver's license," he said quietly, sliding his documents across the counter. The clerk, a woman in her 30s with perfectly manicured nails, rolled her eyes. "These documents are expired. You can't use these." Harold's weathered face creased with confusion. "Ma'am, I brought everything on the list. My birth certificate, my social security card, I said they're expired," she interrupted, not bothering to look at him properly. "Next." The word hit Harold like a slap. He stood frozen, feeling the weight of 20 people behind him in line, their impatient sighs cutting through the air like accusations. "Please, miss, I've been driving for 56 years without a single accident. I just need—" "Sir, step aside. You're holding up the line." Her tone carried the kind of dismissive authority that Harold had spent his youth fighting against in foreign lands. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, each document a piece of his identity being rejected, discarded, deemed worthless. The irony wasn't lost on him. These same hands had once been deemed worthy enough to hold American lives in their palm. As Harold stepped away from the counter, something inside him cracked. Not broke entirely, but developed one of those hairline fractures that would eventually split wide open. He found an empty chair in the corner, the kind of plastic seat that seemed designed to discourage lingering. Around him, the DMV hummed with the casual cruelty of bureaucracy. Teenagers getting their first licenses squealed with excitement. Middle-aged professionals tapped impatiently on their phones. Soccer moms juggled screaming toddlers while clutching renewal forms. And in the corner sat Harold Martinez, invisible despite being surrounded by people. He pulled out his phone, an ancient flip model that his daughter had begged him to replace, and called her number. "Dad, is everything okay?" Sarah's voice carried that particular mixture of love and exasperation that adult children reserve for aging parents. "I'm at the DMV, mija. They won't renew my license. They say my papers are no good." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Harold to hear his own heartbeat. "Dad, I told you to let me handle this. I told you I could take care of it online. I wanted to do it myself," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing things myself for 74 years. Another silence. Then Sarah's sigh, heavy with the weight of 1,000 small defeats. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't sign anything. Don't let them bully you." But Harold had already been bullied. Bullied by a system that had forgotten what he'd given it. Bullied by a young woman who saw only an inconvenient old man, not the soldier who'd carried wounded comrades through hostile territory, not the man who'd received 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, not the father who'd worked 2 jobs for 30 years to put his daughter through medical school. The hour passed like a slow torture. Harold watched person after person approach, the same counter where he'd been dismissed. He watched the clerk smile at young people, show patience with well-dressed professionals, even laugh at someone's joke. But when an elderly woman with a walker approached, needing help with her paperwork, the clerk's demeanor shifted back to that cold efficiency. "You need to fill these out completely," she snapped at the woman. "I can't read this handwriting." Harold's hands clenched into fists. The same clerk who'd taken 15 minutes to chat with a teenager about weekend plans couldn't spare 30 seconds of kindness for someone who'd lived through the Great Depression. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every gray head in America being treated like damaged goods, every senior citizen made to feel like a burden on a society they'd built with their own hands. When Sarah arrived, Harold watched his daughter transform into Dr. Sarah Martinez, the same woman who commanded operating rooms and saved lives daily. She approached the counter with the kind of confidence that Harold used to possess, back when the world still valued what he had to offer. "I'm here about my father's license renewal," she announced to the same clerk. Suddenly, magically, the clerk found her customer service voice. "Of course. What seems to be the problem?" Harold wanted to disappear into the floor. Watching his daughter fight his battles felt like another small death, another piece of his independence floating away like smoke. But something else was building inside him too. Something that had been dormant for too long. Because what nobody in that DMV knew, what the dismissive clerk couldn't possibly understand, was exactly who they'd just humiliated. If you believe that dignity doesn't retire with age, that respect should be earned through a lifetime of service, then you need to hear what happened next. Because sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Harold Martinez wasn't just any veteran. He wasn't just another old man shuffling through government offices, collecting the scraps of bureaucratic mercy. 53 years ago, when he was 21 years old and bulletproof in the way that only young men can be, Harold had volunteered for 3 tours in Vietnam. 3 tours when one was enough to break most men. 3 tours when others were burning draft cards and fleeing to Canada. While his high school classmates were discovering sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Harold was discovering what it meant to bleed for strangers in a jungle halfway around the world. His first Purple Heart came from shrapnel that ripped through his left shoulder during the Tet Offensive. The field medic had told him he was going home. Harold had told the field medic to patch him up because his brothers were still fighting. His second Purple Heart came 6 months later when a landmine turned his world into fire and ringing silence. This time they shipped him to a hospital in Japan, told him his war was over, told him he'd done enough. Harold healed, re-enlisted, and went back. The third Purple Heart came with a Bronze Star for valor. Harold had carried 2 wounded soldiers, one under each arm, through a quarter-mile of hostile territory while taking fire from 3 directions. The citation read like something from a movie script, but the scars on Harold's back were real enough, jagged reminders of hot metal and hotter blood. When he finally came home in 1971, Harold didn't get parades. He got spit on at airports and called baby killer by kids who'd never held anything heavier than a protest sign. He got a job at the post office, married his high school sweetheart, Maria, and spent the next 30 years delivering mail with the same quiet determination he'd once used to deliver his brothers home alive. But now, sitting in this DMV office, watching his daughter argue with a clerk who couldn't be bothered to show basic human decency, Harold felt something awakening that he thought had died in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was the same thing that had made him volunteer for a 3rd tour when common sense screamed at him to stay home. It was the same thing that had made him carry wounded men through hell when every instinct told him to save himself. It was the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the fight seems hopeless. Sarah was making progress at the counter, her medical degree and professional bearing commanding the respect that her father's Silver Star and Purple Hearts couldn't. The clerk was actually reviewing Harold's documents now, actually considering that maybe, just maybe, an elderly veteran deserved the same courtesy as anyone else. But Harold knew this victory was temporary, superficial. Tomorrow there would be another Harold at another counter, facing another clerk who saw only an inconvenience, where there should have been honor. The problem wasn't just this one woman or this one office. The problem was bigger, deeper, more systemic than any individual interaction. The problem was that America had forgotten how to see its elders as anything other than obstacles to efficiency. Harold's phone buzzed, a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, whose husband had served in Korea. At the grocery store, cashier was so rude to Mr. Peterson from down the street. Made him count his change 3 times. He's 92 and served in World War II. I wanted to cry. Harold stared at the message until the words blurred. This wasn't isolated. This was epidemic. Across the country, in DMV offices and grocery stores and bank lobbies, America's greatest generation was being treated like America's biggest burden. Men who'd stormed beaches and women who'd built bombers were being dismissed, ignored, patronized by people who owed their freedom to sacrifices they couldn't begin to comprehend. What happened next would change everything, not just for Harold, not just for that DMV office, but for an entire state's understanding of what it meant to honor service. Sarah had finally gotten the clerk to process Harold's renewal, but the damage was done. As they walked toward the exit, Harold's shuffle had become something different. Each step carried the weight of accumulated disrespect, of a lifetime of service being reduced to bureaucratic inconvenience. They were almost to the door when Harold heard a voice behind them. "Excuse me, sir." Harold turned, expecting another problem, another humiliation. Instead, he found himself facing a man in his 50s, wearing an Army veteran baseball cap. The man's eyes were fixed on Harold's left hand, specifically on the ring Harold had worn for 30 years. A simple gold band with 3 small purple stones and a bronze star. "Are you Harold Martinez?" the man asked, his voice carrying a strange mixture of disbelief and reverence. Harold nodded slowly, uncertain where this was leading. "Harold Martinez, 3rd Battalion, 1st Infantry." Now Harold's back straightened, muscle memory overriding arthritis. "Yes." The man's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, my name is Robert Chen. My father was Private First Class David Chen. You carried him out of Firebase Charlie in November of 1970. The words hit Harold like electricity. He remembered David Chen, 20 years old, barely old enough to shave, with a picture of his girlfriend taped inside his helmet. Harold remembered the weight of David's body as he dragged him to safety. Remembered the blood. Remembered the way. David had whispered, "Thank you," before the medics took over. "Your father," Harold said slowly. "Is he?" "Alive, sir. Married my mother in 1973. Had 4 kids. Became an engineer. Built bridges for 40 years. Robert Chen's voice was shaking now. "He named me after you, sir. Robert Harold Chen. He told me about you every Veterans Day, about how you saved his life when you could have saved yourself." The DMV office had gone silent around them. Every conversation had stopped. Every person in that building was witnessing something they didn't fully understand, but somehow knew was important. Robert Chen wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call, right there in the middle of the DMV. "Dad, you need to get down here, right now. Bring Mom, bring everyone." He looked back at Harold. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to call someone else. Someone who needs to know what happened here today." Harold didn't understand, but he nodded. Robert dialed another number. "This is Robert Chen. I'm standing in the Riverside DMV office with Medal of Honor recipient Harold Martinez, and I just watched your employees treat him like garbage." Harold started to correct him. He'd never received the Medal of Honor. But Robert held up a hand. "No, sir. I don't care about protocols. I don't care about normal channels. This man saved my father's life in Vietnam, and your office just refused him basic courtesy because he's old." What Harold didn't know was that Robert Chen wasn't just any concerned citizen. Robert Chen was the Veteran Affairs Liaison to the governor's office. Robert Chen had direct access to people who could make waves. Big waves. Within 30 minutes, the DMV office was transformed. David Chen arrived first, now 73 himself, walking with a cane but moving faster than Harold had seen any septuagenarian move. Behind him came his wife, his children, his grandchildren. 3 generations of a family that existed because Harold Martinez had once refused to leave a brother behind. David Chen approached Harold with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Harold," he said simply. And then the 2 old soldiers embraced in the middle of a government office, surrounded by strangers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "You saved my life," David whispered. "You gave me everything I have." But the transformation was just beginning. Word was spreading through phones and social media. A local news crew arrived. Then another. Then a reporter from the state capitol. The story was simple but powerful. War hero humiliated at DMV. Saved fellow veteran recognizes him. Community rallies. But the implications were enormous. This wasn't just about Harold Martinez anymore. This was about every veteran, every senior citizen, every person who'd given their best years to their country, only to be treated as an inconvenience in their golden years. The governor's office called within 2 hours. Not an assistant or a secretary, but the governor himself. Harold found himself on the phone with the state's highest elected official while sitting in his daughter's car in the DMV parking lot, still processing what had just happened. "Mr. Martinez," the governor said, "I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today, and I want to do something about it." What the governor proposed went beyond apology. It went beyond policy change. It went straight to the heart of how a society chooses to honor its heroes. "I want to declare a state holiday in your honor," the governor said. Veterans Recognition Day, a day when every government office, every school, every business in this state takes time to remember what our veterans have given us. Harold was speechless. Sarah, who was listening on speakerphone, was crying. The idea seemed impossible, too big, too much for one old man who just wanted to renew his driver's license. But the governor wasn't finished. "More than that, Mr. Martinez, I want you to help us design training programs for every state employee. I want them to understand that when they see an elderly person struggling with paperwork, they might be looking at someone who bled for their freedom. I want them to understand that patience isn't just good customer service, it's patriotic duty." The media coverage exploded overnight. Harold's story spread from local news to national headlines. Cable news shows picked it up. Social media amplified it. But most importantly, it resonated with millions of Americans who'd watched their own parents and grandparents navigate an increasingly impersonal world with diminishing dignity. Letters poured into the governor's office from other states, asking how they could implement similar programs. Veteran organizations that had been struggling for funding suddenly found themselves with corporate sponsors. DMV offices across the country quietly revised their training protocols, reminding employees that courtesy wasn't optional. The clerk who'd dismissed Harold so callously found herself reassigned to a position where she could learn to see people as individuals rather than inconveniences. She wasn't fired, but she was given the opportunity to understand what service really meant. Because this story wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. It was about remembering that behind every wrinkled face might be a hero. Behind every slow step might be someone who once ran toward danger so others could walk in safety. 6 months later, Harold Martinez stood on the steps of the state capitol, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in decades. The bronze star gleamed on his chest, but it was overshadowed by something more precious. The knowledge that his humiliation had been transformed into honor not just for himself, but for every veteran who'd ever been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. Governor Patricia Williams, herself the daughter of a Korean War veteran, read the proclamation declaring the first annual Harold Martinez Veterans Recognition Day. The crowd included David Chen and his family, dozens of other veterans Harold had served with, and hundreds of citizens who understood that honoring the past was the only way to secure the future. But the most meaningful moment came when a group of DMV employees approached Harold after the ceremony. They were young people mostly, the same age as the clerk who'd started this entire chain of events. One by one, they thanked him for his service, not because they had to, but because they finally understood what that service meant. "Mr. Martinez," said a young woman who could have been the twin of the clerk who'd dismissed him, "I work at the DMV office in Springfield. After your story came out, we had training about treating seniors with respect. Last week, an elderly man came in with expired documents just like you, but instead of turning him away, I helped him figure out what he needed. Turns out he was a Pearl Harbor survivor." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "His name was William Thompson. He passed away 3 days later. I was the last government employee he ever interacted with. Because of you, because of what happened to you, I was able to give him the respect he deserved. I was able to honor his service instead of adding to his burden." Harold felt tears on his cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of completion, of purpose fulfilled. His humiliation had been transformed into something greater than personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for systemic change, a reminder that every person carrying the weight of years might also be carrying the weight of service, sacrifice, and stories that deserved honor rather than dismissal. The holiday became permanent, written into state law with bipartisan support. Other states followed suit. DMV offices nationwide began implementing service recognition training, teaching employees to look beyond appearances to the possible histories hidden beneath gray hair and slow movements. But the real change was cultural. Harold's story became a touchstone, a reminder that in an increasingly fast-paced world, taking time to see people as individuals rather than obstacles wasn't just good manners. It was moral imperative. Businesses began implementing senior-friendly policies not because they were required to, but because they understood that today's elderly customers were yesterday's heroes. Schools began inviting local veterans to speak not just on Veterans Day, but throughout the year, helping young people understand that history wasn't something that happened to other people in other times, but something carried in the hearts and memories of the elderly people they passed on the street every day. Harold Martinez never sought fame or recognition. He'd simply wanted to renew his driver's license with the same dignity he'd tried to live his entire life. But sometimes individual moments of injustice become collective moments of awakening. Sometimes one person's humiliation becomes everyone's opportunity for redemption. Sometimes the universe takes a small act of cruelty and transforms it into a large act of grace. Harold continued to drive for 3 more years after that day at the DMV, not because he had to, but because he could. Because a system that had once seen him as an inconvenience had learned to see him as an inspiration. Because his daughter no longer had to fight his battles for him. Because respect, once lost, had been found again. When Harold finally surrendered his license at age 77, it wasn't because some clerk decided his papers weren't good enough. It was his own choice, made on his own terms, with his dignity intact. The DMV employee who processed his voluntary surrender was a young veteran, herself recently returned from Afghanistan. She recognized Harold's name from the training materials she'd studied. "Mr. Martinez," she said quietly, "thank you for your service. All of it. Not just in Vietnam, but here at home, fighting for all of us to be treated with dignity." Harold smiled and shook her hand. The circle was complete. Service had been honored. Sacrifice had been recognized. And somewhere in America, another elderly veteran was walking into another government office, carrying papers and hope, knowing that the world was a little bit kinder than it had been before. If you've seen an elderly person struggling and taken a moment to help, if you've looked beyond gray hair to see the person beneath, if you've ever wondered what stories those who've lived long lives might have to tell, leave a comment below and share how you honor the seniors in your life. Because every day we have the choice to add dignity to the world or subtract it. Harold Martinez chose to add. Now it's our turn.